All right, welcome back to Velshi and Ruhle. A consequential day, well, to say the least, in the United Kingdom. Prime Minister Theresa May fights to keep her job amid Brexit deal discussions. Right now, members of the Conservative Party are voting in a secret ballot determining whether or not they have confidence in the Prime Minister.
If May loses this vote, it could trigger a no-deal exit when the UK leaves the European Union next March, possibly leading to a total breakdown of trade between the two. But what does all that mean? What is the big picture here? And most importantly, why should you at home care? All
right, let me walk over here and give you some sense of it. This no confidence vote is just another step in the shift away from the global liberal democratic political order that has dominated since the end of World War II. The shift away from globalism, which in some circles has become a negative term, and more toward protectionism, isolationism, and nationalism. In the United Kingdom, Conservative Prime Minister May is getting squeezed from all sides when it comes to Brexit, which, as a mainstream conservative, she didn't actually support, but she's in charge of implementing. On her left are mainstream liberals and conservatives, people in the middle of the political spectrum who never wanted to leave the EU in the first place. They'd prefer to keep things as is. On the right are protectionists who think trade alliances are bad for the UK and who want to cut all ties to Europe, total isolation. And they are joined by many in the working class who may be liberal or conservative, who think trade with the EU has been great for elites but bad for workers and farmers. Now, this is not too far off from the struggle facing May's European colleagues like German Chancellor Angela Merkel or French President Emmanuel Macron. In Germany, Merkel has acknowledged the decline in support for her center-right party, the Christian Democrats, and has announced her plans to step down. In France, Macron has given in to the demands of protesters after weeks of violent demonstrations, but it hasn't really assuaged them. The reemergence of nationalism in the 21st century began as a pushback against globalism. Working class people, like these demonstrators in France, feel cheated and left behind by major trade deals that only seem to benefit the rich. And isolationist politicians are seizing on their anger as an opportunity to push their agenda. The question remains, if Western democracy in Europe is under fire, what does that mean for America? And that's an interesting question because all of these things we saw happening in Europe before we saw them in America. Brexit came before the election of Donald Trump.
Great points. They're all connected. Joining us now live in London, columnist and writer for The Times, Hugo Rifkind, and NBC News foreign correspondent, who, fortunately for us, is here with us in New York today, Matt Bradley. All right, Hugo, you have a wicked analogy.
It's great, yeah.
About Brexit and a submarine made of cheese. That's right, cheese. Can you explain it?
Can I explain it? Not really. It was just an idea I had that the problem with Brexit is it's a completely impractical thing to do. And Theresa May is under attack for doing this completely impractical thing. People say badly. People say it's not going to work. My analogy was to do with the fact that, of course, it's not going to work. It's like trying to make a submarine out of cheese. It's a bad idea. You can do it well or badly, but it's still a bad thing.
Right. And ultimately, Matt Bradley, it is a submarine made of cheese. She is trying to make it a, I don't know, a less cheesy submarine or whatever the case is. But that's the problem. She didn't believe in Brexit in the first place, and she's trying to moderate this exit from the European Union on March 29th, and she can't seem to cut a deal that gets broad support.
And that's kind of the best thing that she has going for her right now. She can, turn around and say, well, no one else is going to be able to do this. This is a submarine made of cheese. Try piloting that. You're going to fail. If another leader comes in, they're going to fail. Nobody's going to be able to negotiate this agreement and navigate these perilous waters between all of these different people who really none of them wanted Brexit to begin with. So it's all of these people who are reluctantly trying to bring about a deal that none of them really want, that they all believe the country doesn't want, and they're being forced from the bottom up by, as you mentioned, populists in Britain who are determined to get this. And it's funny that you mentioned this thing about economics and trade. When we talk about Brexit, we talk about trade, but in Britain, a lot of people think about immigration, which is a lot of what the populist upswell here is about.
Right. Stephanie, Hugo, when Stephanie and I talk about things, we often look at it through a lens of economics, and to some degree, a lot of immigration issues are to do with economics. But how do you think, how should the UK be looking at this?
Well, I mean, your introduction right at the beginning, suggesting that Brexit was a protectionist movement, I think is not quite right. Certainly, a lot of the people who supported Brexit might have protectionist leanings, but Brexit-supporting politicians largely are more free trade than the EU. That's kind of their problem with the EU. So I mean, but really for the UK, the challenge is do we do this thing? Do we do this thing that there is a mandate for? 52% of people voted for. Yet it seems that there is no way forward to do it. Yet there's also a lack of political courage to decide not to do it. So sooner or later, my thinking is sooner or later the debate has got to in some way be reopened with the public. Although whether that happens at an election or another referendum some people are talking about, I've no idea.
You actually bring up a good point. There are a lot of people who supported Brexit not because they're anti-trade. They don't like the regulations and the constraints that they believe being part of the EU imposed upon Brits.
Well, I mean, as I'm sure in a way you see it in America as well, there's a big division between the politicians who are driving Brexit and the motives of the people who were voting for them. I'm sure that many of the motives of the people who were voting for them probably were protectionist in a way. They want to bring back industry, they want to, sort of recreate industry, at least in the north. Whereas the project politically was driven by quite savage free trade advocates, people who really wanted to internationalize, to globalize more.
Right, that's a good point. So Matt, to Hugo's point, it only underscores the idea that there are so many parties on either side of this thing. What does this end up looking like to you? On March 29th, is there going to be some deal, or does British trade with the EU end and something new begins?
It all depends on what happens in the next couple of days with this election. So if Theresa May gets rejected by her own political party, then we're going to have a new prime minister. Now, that could take weeks or months to come up with, and the clock is ticking because, as you mentioned, by March 29th, Britain will leave the EU regardless of what happens. Now, if they do it without a deal, that would be a hard Brexit. That means just casting Britain out away from the EU. It's the equivalent of jumping off Big Ben and hoping you're going to land on something soft.
Right.
It's not going to be good for markets or Britain.
To Hugo's point, that doesn't, if you're a free trader, doesn't necessarily help you because you go into a world where you're outside of all these deals and you now have to renegotiate them. Guys, thanks very much.
Like leaving TPP.
Yeah, that's like leaving TPP. Hey, MSNBC fans, thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on that button down there and click on any of the videos here to watch the latest interviews and highlights. You can get more MSNBC for free every day with our newsletters. Just visit msnbc.com/newsletters to sign up now.